Let us take a few moments just to find a little quieting of the mind. It is helpful if I pay attention to my breathing. Again, a reminder that it is through breath that the spiritual energy enters into our organism and keeps it alive. It is helpful not to hold your breath outside or inside or to artificially force it, but just becoming aware of the breath naturally changes the quality of breathing. Let me make a few general remarks, some of which have been made earlier as well. Clearly, it's rather obvious that whenever a person encounters another culture or any remark from some other, or any text from another cultural tradition, how one responds to this very much depends on the quality of the person who is receiving it. As a simple example, Vivekananda, when he was very struck by encountering the teachings of the Christ, when he undertook to go on a long journey, actually walking from one edge of India to the other, when he became a monastic, he carried with him only two books. One was the Bhagavad Gita, which would make sense from the perspective of the Indian tradition. Personally, in my judgment, that is the single most important text to emerge from India. And Aldous Huxley makes this remark that it is the paradigm example of perennial philosophy. So I recommend that to people. But the other book that he carried with him was Imitatio Christi, Imitation of Christ, quite an ancient book in the Christian tradition. Because for him, he in fact even makes a remark that if he had actually been present in Bethlehem when Christ was there, he would have washed his feet not only with water or with his tears, but with the blood of his heart. This is Vivekananda, you see, because he's much more responsive to hearing something at a deeper level. Another remark, which sometimes people question it, but really a culture is usually transmitted from one generation to the next through what we bring to the children. This may seem rather strange, but so therefore things have to be very much simplified. And then, of course, those who have some spiritual search in them, usually by the time they become teenagers or a little later, they begin to understand the same thing slightly more deeply, or they begin to question it quite rightly. But if one keeps insisting that it has to be understood at that same level at which it was mentioned to the kids, then many people just say, to hell with it, they give up. Which is the reason I often remind people here. It may surprise. If you know any exceptions, please let me know. In the Western academic world, hardly any philosophers would ever refer to anything in the Gospels or by the letters of St. Paul. Just because partly because they are academics and so they have intellectual fairly amount of good intellect. And since they have been taught only as kids something which doesn't any longer make them, so they just give up the whole thing. In fact, my friend Andrea actually said to me the other day, she has returned to Christianity because of listening to me to speak about Christ. Otherwise, she had given up on this. She's sitting right here, so you can ask her. I will give you an example of this. For example, how the three magi are mentioned to the kids. Do you want to show that slide here? This is a very great church in France, in the city of Autun, A-U-T-U-N. The three magi are within us. Three different faculties, thinking, bodily movements, feelings, and unless they are energized, there is no way we can actually encounter any serious teaching. Look at this. This is not something I made up. This is in the church in a city called A-U-T-U-N, I don't know how you pronounce it, Autun, in France. Similarly, I'll give you another example. It's very frequently mentioned, and there are many, many paintings and sculptures of St. George killing the dragon. And especially in England, this is one of their national symbols, St. George killing the dragon. In a monastery on Mount Athos, the name of the monastery is rather complicated. I was actually there. I had much difficulty figuring out the name of this. Alandrios. The dragon is actually the face of St. George. Repeatedly, I have quoted Christ saying, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. But whenever it is expressed more stridently, then it is almost, unless you get rid of yourself, unless you kill yourself, be free of yourself. So there in this monastery, a large sculpture, St. George is holding, as it were, his own head, which he's submitting to Christ. I did not have a picture of this to show you, but take my word for it, you can look for it. Because it is, what dragon are we trying to struggle with? It's the dragon inside. It's very easy to externalize all this. Everything that is said about the Buddha or Christ or Krishna gets externalized. And then we can teach it to the kids, who can sometimes memorize it for a little while until approximately the age of 10 or 11. After that, they begin to question it. Then they begin to leave it out or just get against it or to say, to hell with it, it doesn't make any sense, etc. So I invite you to consider seriously. It's not to say that we should not be teaching to the kids. This is how any culture is transmitted actually through like this. You watch kids in India, they go to the temple, they would naturally bow down. But here going to the church has a slightly different tendencies, different practices, which is fine. What I'm saying is that that practice or that tendency or whatever they learn as kids continues as part of their learning. And this is how they understand what that religion is about. And whenever they begin to question it, that's where the problem comes. Okay, then I just want to again and again invite you to think how many people are actually interested in spiritual search out of the 8 billion on the planet. I occasionally, you may have even heard me say that, my own impression is that I would be surprised if more than 5 or 6% people have even occasionally any interest in spiritual search. But when I say this, one also has to impartially look at oneself. It is also equally true that I myself don't spend more than 5% of my time searching for this. You look at yourself. This is what, it's all very easy to speak about great traditions, spiritual truths said by the great sages. Who among us is actually seriously interested in searching? Then how long do we spend on it? How much time, energy? And again, a suggestion from various teachings that whatever is said by any great sage cannot actually be understood by our ordinary mind. We need to belong to what is sometimes, or Krishnamurti would say, intelligence beyond thought. Or there are several other ways of saying it, that thinking is not able to comprehend truth. Almost the first substantial sutra in the Yoga Sutra is, yoga is stopping all the movements of the mind. So therefore, this suggestion is not therefore to be against the mind, but to be connecting with the higher level of the mind, if you like, moving from the monkey mind to the Buddha mind, if one can make it. So the word mind, because in English we end up using the same word, mind, you can use the the Greek word nous rather than dianoia, or the Sanskrit word buddhi rather than manas. And then very strong suggestion that unless one is connected with that level of the mind, one cannot really understand the real truth. Even the expressions of the great sages, Christ said something, the Buddha said something, of course they have, ultimately they get conveyed in ordinary language, but to understand the subtlety behind that would require intelligence beyond thought. And therefore, the suggestion again and again is, how do we connect with that? And that itself, first of all, requires actually practicing seriously to be more and more free of our usual quality of thinking, which usually means I agree, I don't agree, then I argue one way or the other, and thus it goes. The moment I argue, I'm already at a lower level of the mind. I can certainly say this again and again. Somebody brings something, if I don't understand it, I can be quiet. And if something, another perspective seems to me to be a better way of saying it, one could probably bring this, but it's not a question of an argument. It's really hearing different ways of coming closer and closer to understanding something. Otherwise, we could listen to what the Buddha said, or contemporary times, what Raman Maharshi said, or what Krishnamurti said, and then we can begin to, I agree, I don't agree, we can argue one way or the other. How is this going to help us understand what they're trying to say? And again, a suggestion, this is explicitly the remarks of Christ actually, that only those are called in whom God has initiated a call for the search. As he actually even says, only those can go to heaven who came down from heaven. This is in the very first chapter of John's Gospel. But yesterday I had tried to say this slightly differently. For example, in the alchemical tradition, that unless there is a little bit of gold already, the lead cannot be transformed into gold. So to search within yourself, do you sometimes strongly feel the call to understand why I am alive? And to be sure, there are two more or less different ways people approach this kind of question. not to dismiss either one of them. One comes from a kind of a fear that in a few years or a few decades I will die. Whatever I call Ravi will die, obviously. That's the one fact that nobody could disagree with. Last year, our university where I used to teach, now I'm retired, and they were celebrating their 200th anniversary and had published the photographs of nice, handsome-looking young men. Mostly at that time, only males were going to the university, at least at that university, from the 1900s. And they are all approximately 24 years old or 23, just graduating, all looking all very handsome. But guaranteedly, not a single one of them is now alive. This is a photograph taken in 1901. So I was looking at this photograph, about 50 or so very nice looking young men, and they were especially for that photograph at that time, because photographs were rather unusual at that time. So they're all dressed very nicely. These days, there are more photographs per day than were in the previous century. So things have changed in attitude. But to look at this photograph was actually a great reminder to me. Somebody might look at my photograph graduating from the university in a few years, and I will no longer be there. So I often remind people or invite them to think of as if you are looking at your own gathering, let's say this gathering, from the year 2090. I'm choosing that because nobody would here be still alive in that. What would be the one thing that you wish to convey to the people? Consider this seriously. Because that is not what we usually get occupied with in our life. That's the reason I'm mentioning it. Because most of the time, and you don't need to take my word for it, I'm just myself telling you that I myself don't spend more than a few % of my time or energy in searching for something. How many people are searching for something? How much time and energy do you spend searching for something? Serious. Whatever we might call spiritual search. But again and again, the suggestion, something, again, I had quoted this earlier. This is when Nicodemus comes to meet Christ. Nicodemus is a member of the Jewish council, by the way, the council that had actually ultimately condemned Christ to be crucified. But that was by a majority vote there. Not everybody on the council voted for this. And he comes, and his very first question is, how can one enter the kingdom of heaven? Or how can one go to God? And useful reminder from Christ that one has to be born again, born of the Spirit. Obviously, here, everywhere in the planet, is born of the flesh, but to be born of the Spirit. And that is really the meaning of virgin birth. It gets attached, otherwise very much occupied with genitalia. And just simply to remind people, particularly of Christian background here, that even when Christ himself is saying something or doing something, his other people, usually the Pharisees, is reminding him of his other brothers and sisters. So his mother already has children earlier. This is right in the canonical gospel. This is not something that I am saying even from some other extremely outside gospel. It's right in the canonical gospels. So it's not that Mother Mary did not have children earlier, but the suggestion really is that the birth of Christ is a spiritual birth. It's not a carnal birth. And the call to each one of us is to be able to have a spiritual birth. And for that, then again and again a suggestion that in any case, the very reason why I exist or you exist is that a particle of divinity has taken on this body in order to evolve. I don't know whether I quoted to you earlier here, Saint Athanasius, 3rd century, very highly regarded saint in Christian tradition, said, God became man so that man may become God. That is the call for us to return to God again and again. But always keeping in mind, thousands of people are doing physics, but not everybody is at the level of Einstein or Newton. Similarly, millions of people may be undertaking a wish for spiritual enhancement. That doesn't mean they come to the level of the Christ or the Buddha. These are extraordinary sages. But that doesn't stop people from doing physics. Those who wish to do physics are doing. So that if you're interested in spiritual search, that doesn't mean that unless I'm getting to the level of Christ, I should not undertake the spiritual birth. This will be quite a crazy undertaking. We need to do what speaks to our soul, and that again and again I'm simply reminding that the whole purpose of why this spiritual energy has taken on my body is so that my body can undertake the appropriate actions to assist the evolution of this particle of divinity in me. Ultimately, as it were, to return to the source, to return home, return to God. That is a very high level, but that's the direction. And so let me now undertake here. I had, for the last few days, spoken a little bit about some of the major differences in the Eastern and Western approaches, or when I say approaches, they're really more, I should be saying, not in terms of so much the practice as how they are theologically or philosophically expressed. And then suggesting again and again that in the global culture, not to get so stuck on that only one expression of truth is the only truth, and to try to go beyond the expression. And I had given you this example from the history of physics. I don't want to repeat that now here. But the call, nevertheless, is that to me, it seems rather obvious. It's rather silly to imagine that half the sages of the world got the matter wrong. Unless, as I was saying even yesterday, unless you have a missionary position, of course, they are not sages anyway. They are just crazy. So obviously they have it wrong. But that's a very missionary position. But if you are a searcher, it is actually helpful to have more than one expression of truth. It can, because any expression, even at its best, is like a finger pointing to the moon. Not to get so attached to the finger, then you can never get to the moon. Let me here mention that it is inevitable, if a person is interested, sooner or later, sometimes we say accidentally or with the help of some friend or the other, they encounter a teaching. You can ask yourself, those of you who are members of the Theosophical Society, how did you become members of the society? Was it accidental? Did you run into somebody? Did you have a friend? How did you become members of this? Similarly, if people are interested in the teaching of Krishnamurti or teaching of Guruji, that sometimes it actually happens seemingly accidentally. I was actually very surprised on one occasion. This was at Princeton in a library. Just somebody had suggested a book to me, and I did not have a copy of it, and the bookstore did not have a copy of it. But I went into the library, and almost as if this book fell on me. Really, you'll have to take my word for it. I was not looking at the right place or anything like this, but as if there are many forces which are even wishing to assist us. In any case, somebody sooner or later encounters the teaching which something strikes one. Not every teaching strikes everybody. And it is also true that each teaching has slightly different practice or different emphasis, especially at the earlier stages. I had a friend who gave rather a nice example, very American example. He said, supposing there are 5 or 6 people trying to go to the White House, and one of them is starting from the Sahara Desert, another is starting from the Pacific Ocean. Obviously, one would be coming on a camel to start with, the other one will be coming in a boat, and somebody else may be coming from another state, they might be coming in a car. So it is obvious that initially the journey is started by people in very different vehicles, depending on where they are coming from. But closer they get to the White House, their clothing becomes similar, their vehicles become similar. Initially, there are many great differences. Whether they ultimately lead to the same White House, I mentioned to you the other day, I can't say this personally from my experience, but I mentioned Ramakrishna in India, who actually, in fact, said that by practicing and experiencing, starting from the Christian tradition and from the Islamic tradition, and of course he was a Hindu himself, that they in fact lead to the same vision, same kind of truth. But otherwise, we can certainly see there are bound to be, a very simple example, most people connected with the Krishnamurti teaching, or I think even in the esoteric theosophy here, they don't think having a wine or meat is a good idea at all. Although when I was specially invited by the Krishnamurti people, their people there specially invited me for dinner, offering me wine. I was quite surprised by this, actually. Whereas in the Guruji circle, there is nothing against this. If this is what you need or wish, that's okay. So initially, what I'm saying is there are differences in various teachings. And some of you also probably heard me tell you this story told to me by Radha Bernier. The Dalai Lama coming to Olcott, the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in America, and for breakfast he wanted bacon and eggs, much to the surprise of every theosophist there. But coming from Tibet, maybe different practice, different clothing. Just to remind you, Zen, at least I know one Zen master in California who wears jeans. Why? Why should he still be wearing the same thing as they were wearing in India? Would that? So I think there is no reason to get so stuck with any of these starting points in various traditions and teachings. But remember, the question really is, what is one searching for? Initially, when a person encounters a teaching, I'm speaking about different stages now here. Naturally, any intelligent person would seriously want to understand more and more about the teaching, so they have many questions. They read many books about what, for example, if you're in theosophy, you would want to read what Annie Besant wrote, but even before that, what HPB said, how to understand. And if you look at the collected works of HPB, there is a whole shelf full there. It's not so easy to understand everything she wrote, I can assure you. But somebody would be naturally quite interested, trying to understand. And one would have many questions about what does she mean by Fohat? Or I use that one expression simply because this is a very important idea in the secret doctrine. And many things like this. One has many questions. But an important shift that takes place is from I have a question to I am in question. Because the call in any serious teaching has to do with the who in me is searching for anything, and how can I move from my usual superficial self to a deeper and deeper self, connecting with this spiritual reality. And therefore, this shift is an extremely important shift. And what that requires, and this is such a fundamental requirement in any spiritual search, is an impartial self-study. Other words are used: self-knowledge, self-observation, self-inquiry. So don't get stuck on one word or the other, but all of them basically are saying, if this character Ravi is interested in anything that he thinks is spiritual search, who is interested in him? And the call always is that he has many levels of his self, completely superficial, self-centered, self-occupied, selfish. We sometimes call it very egotistic. But it is also possible that there is a level in him which can be free of these things and wishes to search for the truth. But we can fantasize that this is the case, but how, unless I see what I actually am? Therefore, self-inquiry is the fundamental requirement in any serious teaching. I may have quoted this more than once, Krishnamurti's remark, there can be no wisdom without self-inquiry. Actually, I think I even have a slightly longer remark of his here that I will read to you. I can find it quickly here. Here, if I do not understand myself, my cravings, my motives, my contradictions, how can I comprehend truth? If I am not aware of my contradictory states, if I am passionate, ignorant, greedy, envious, meditation only strengthens the self-enclosing process. Without self-knowledge, there is no foundation for right thinking. Without right thinking, thought, feeling cannot transcend itself. This is Krishnamurti's remark. Again, you see the difference here. He often talks about going beyond thinking, but then he says right thinking is required. This is always the problem. If we use just one word for thought, then it seems as if he's against thinking. No, he's calling us to think truly, think rightly, right thought. But then sometimes he calls it, I think I earlier mentioned this here, awareness beyond thought or something like that. Intelligence beyond thought. So it's actually, self-inquiry is really almost the fundamental requirement. And then you see this, you can look at the whole concordance of the entire Bible. You cannot find a single entry under self-inquiry or self-knowledge. Because that's not what the churches are interested in. Hundreds of entries under belief or faith or something, and a few entries under knowledge also, but nothing under self-knowledge. But then if you read any of the Christian or Jewish or Islamic sages, they repeatedly focus on this. And then it just becomes kind of non-canonical. So let me now quote to you from a non-canonical gospel, Gospel of Thomas. I think I quoted this yesterday also. Kingdom of God is within you and without you. If you would know God, you must know yourself. When you know yourself, you would be known, and you would realize that you are the son of the living Father, not somebody else. You are the son of the living Father. If you do not know yourself, you are in poverty. In fact, you are poverty. Very strong statement. This is Gospel of Thomas, 2nd chapter, if you're interested in reading it. Everywhere, any of you interested in the Yoga Sutra, for example, Swadhyaya is the Sanskrit word for this. Literally means self-study. But again, I may have mentioned this to you, how the cultures are invariably always degenerate, focus on a very low level. If you look at contemporary Sanskrit English dictionary, the word Swadhyaya is first translation is studying sacred books. What the hell that has got to do with the word Swadhyaya is not at all clear to me. It's only the third or the fourth meaning is self-study. I may have mentioned this earlier. I once actually mentioned this to Krishnamurti in one exchange. Several times I had exchanges with him. And he didn't usually use this language publicly, but he said, "Damn it, sir, what is the point of reading sacred books unless you read the book of yourself?" That is the real call. The book of myself, or whatever I am, because then one sees impartially how little of my time and energy is actually spent on whatever I understand by spiritual search. What is distracting me, what is taking me away. And certainly in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, Swadhyaya is very much one of the three main activities he speaks about in the first sutra of the 2nd chapter. And then it is also included among what is called Yama and Niyam. And some of you may be familiar with the Yoga Sutras. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna very much speaks about this. It is also another word that will be relevant to speak in a moment here. But let me first of all just use that Sanskrit word, yagya. It's almost always translated as sacrifice. So Krishna says people undertake yagya in many different ways, by giving charities. But for those of serious vows, yagya consists of swadhyaya, self-study. And it does call for a sacrifice, because one would soon see I am not as great I wish to be, or I would imagine to be, or I would like to convey to the others that I am. One would see the devilish tendencies in one. I think I may have quoted to you a remark of Rumi, if you have not yet seen the devil, go look in the mirror. What does it mean, devil? Literally, the word Satan in Hebrew and Mara in Pali, Mara is the one who's the devil who's trying to seduce the Buddha to be yet before he's the Buddha. Both of these words mean obstacle, what stands in our way. If nothing stands in my way, then there is no need for me to search. No need for me to practice anything. Nothing is standing in my way. So it will be amazing not to encounter obstacles in one, or therefore the devil in one, partly because of the standard idea in every spiritual teaching that in principle, the whole and external cosmos is mirrored inside us. Why not the devil? He is also part of the cosmos. And especially, this is actually much more strongly expressed in the biblical tradition than in the Indian tradition. First of all, just to remind you, Lucifer was the highest of all angels. There are 9 orders of angels, he was the highest of all angels. Because of pride, and as is said by Prophet Isaiah says, because he wished to be like the Most High, so he was expelled. Because no creature can be like the Creator, something that I've been speaking about in the Abrahamic traditions. But still, if you look at any of the prophets, none of them could come. In India, we might say none of them could be enlightened, but that's an Indian expression, but none of them could come to heaven or to be saved by God without being tested by the devil. Same is true in India. For example, the Buddha, that's the classical example, that the Buddha is tested by Mara, which is the equivalent of the devil. And invariably, the tests have to do with either certain kind of desires or fears. Just to take the example from the Buddha, first thing Mara does is to send his own daughters. Sometimes it is said 3 daughters, sometimes it said 7 daughters. So it seems to vary in the tradition. But he sends all his daughters to seduce him. Now, if anybody here is wholly free of some sexual desire, maybe I should ask you to raise your hand, but maybe that's not a good idea. That may not be a good idea. None of us will actually be sitting here unless somebody had engaged in sexual intercourse. Sex is the strongest force in nature. In fact, a remark of the Buddha in the Buddhist tradition, and I'm merely just quoting that, he said, if there was another force as strong as sex, I'm not sure I would have made it. This is the remark of the Buddha. And since that does not work for Mara in this case, so then he says, I will turn this mountain into a mountain of gold. Look at yourself. How many $1 million will do? Or do we really need a whole mountain of gold? Then that I will turn this, I will give you sovereignty over the whole world. Power, wealth, pleasure. Personally, I think we don't need to even necessarily classify them into 3 categories. They are intimately connected with each other, actually. But it's easier to express them or explain them by separating each one of them. But that doesn't work for in the case of Siddhartha Gautam. By the way, that's his name before he becomes the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautam. Then Mara sends his armies to try to kill him. Fear, desire, these are the 2 words periodically used in the whole of the Buddhist literature again and again. And similarly, you look at any of the, for example, what did the Buddha then say? He didn't deny that Mara is also there. This is a remark of the Buddha. Mara, you are a part and parcel of myself. Everything in the whole cosmos is in principle mirrored inside me, including Mara or the devil. But to find its appropriate place, which is much easily conveyed by the expression of Christ being tempted by the Satan, get thee behind me, Satan. Satan, Mara, has a lot of energy, can actually assist, or whatever we might, putting it in slightly contemporary terminology, ego has a lot of energy. To use it to accomplish something, determination, staying with it, to hell with it, I'm not going to give up. requires a lot of energy, a lot of egotistic energy. But then the call always is, can this actually submit to something higher? Again and again I remind people that this particle of divinity which has taken on my body and mind, so my body and mind are the instruments to assist the evolution of this spiritual energy. Why be against the instrument? The instrument needs to be sharpened, needs to be well preserved, so it can actually assist what it is meant to do, namely to assist the evolution of this spiritual energy. Which is the reason, maybe by this time twice or thrice I have quoted to you this remark of my own teacher, Jean de Salzman: ego is a good servant but a bad master. Who wants a servant who wants to just lie around doing nothing? But if the servant decides everything in the household, then that's the problem. Again and again a reminder, and again I'm reminding you, this is not the first time I've said this. Every teaching says there is in slightly different terminology, that there are two in us, in each one of us. St. Paul calls it spiritual nature and carnal nature. There are other expressions. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita has a very strong expression, actually, divine nature and demonic nature. Jean de Salzman calls it angelic nature and animal nature. Sometimes they are called simply self with a capital S and self with a small s. But if one begins to, maybe initially just theoretically, but gradually to actually, in practice, to see the two in me, then it is a fundamental requirement of spiritual search to try to see, understand, what are the main features of these two energies in me. Generally, mostly theoretically, it becomes, theologians are likely to say, just forget about the animal nature, just go for the spiritual. It's mostly theoretical. Whereas most of the time we are occupied with the so-called animal nature or the carnal nature. Certainly the call that speaks to me, and the reason why I regard Jean de Salzman as my teacher, she always very strongly has recommended or spoken about that both of these currents of energies need to be honored. One is coming from the earth side, the other from the heavenly side, and we are children of both heaven and earth. Both parents need to be honored. And that the call of a human being is to become the appropriate instrument which can connect these two energies in the right manner. Therefore, to be able to use the divine energy to actually assist the work on the planet, work on the earth, work on the body, not just to get rid of the body or to forget about one remark of Christ that I mentioned yesterday, my kingdom is not of this world, doesn't mean therefore to get rid of the world. Or the other remark, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, doesn't mean to forget the other world. But both remarks can be taken single-handedly rather than to see how do we relate the two. How can the connection be made? So it's easy. For example, I sometimes am very surprised even Krishnamurti saying, you can give up your job, give up this and that. It's all very easy. Of course, if you have nice somebody taking care of you with large amount of money, it's easier to do this. But there is no such suggestion. If you look at any of the serious sages, I just quoted twice from Christ, both sides are recommended by him. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. But again, a reminder that my kingdom is not of this world. Similarly, look at any remarks or teaching that Krishna brings. He's not asking Arjuna to just go to the Himalayas and start meditating there. He's asking him to undertake what is required for maintaining order in the universe, which may even require fighting in this case. So, very strong suggestion, more emphasized in some teaching than others, that both sides need to be, first of all, recognized, to be understood, and then to try to find an appropriate relationship between them. If I use the word spirit and ego, not to be against the ego, but to find the right place of the ego. If you use the world or heaven and earth, you can use any other expressions to indicate two different sides, two different directions. How do we find the appropriate relationship between them? That, in my understanding, is really the call from the teachings. But then, as I said earlier, so much emphasis on self-study. But it is a very dangerous enterprise, self-study, largely because what I have just been saying, because one can also see the devil in oneself. That can be very discouraging. Especially because we tend to take things very personally, as if I alone have the devil in me, not the others. Gradually, this again and again a suggestion from all the teachers that deeper one goes into oneself, closer one comes to the understanding of the human condition. It's not only Ravi who has this devil in him, every human being has the devil in him. So one begins to understand something about the human condition, therefore potentially even more compassion for everybody. Everybody wants to do good. Everybody wants to live wisely. Very few people manage to do it. Why? Even listen to the remarks of St. Paul. I do not do what I wish to do, and I find myself doing what I am against. This is St. Paul is hardly a negligible person. This is his comment, letter to the Romans. But then he undertakes a practice. For example, he actually even says, you're welcome to read this in the 15th chapter or the first letter to the Corinthians. I have a checker here, so that's his reason I keep giving these references, where he says, I die daily. This is St. Paul. I die daily. And then to the Galatians, letter to the Galatians, he says, I am crucified to the world, yet I live, but not I. Christ lives in me. See the whole transformation. No wonder HPB regarded him as a great initiate. Similarly, Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita asks, why is it that people do things which they do not wish to do? Regarding himself. He's not talking only about other people. This is in the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. And Krishna's response there is that because they are driven by, there the word kama, which means selfish desire. Now here I should remind you, kama in the Rig Veda means love. But by the time it comes a few thousand years later, in the Bhagavad Gita, it changes meaning. Just as the word eros changes meaning. I may have mentioned this, the first fohat, according to HPB, is eros. By fohat is meant coming from the unmanifested regime to the manifestation of the world. It is love in the Rig Veda and is eros in HPB's writings. But these words change their meaning a few centuries later. So, very strong emphasis that if I am just driven by usual selfish desires more and more, then I cannot really serve the particle of divinity that has taken on this body and mind. But there is no suggestion, therefore, to be against the body and the mind, or against whatever I would call small s self. By the way, that's only the meaning of the word ego. I know since the beginning of the 20th century, the ego has been made into just the lowest level. Ego in Greek simply means self or I. All the major expressions of Christ, such as I am the way, the truth, and the life, they all begin with the word ego in Greek. So don't get against the word ego just because it has been made into a whole terrible expression now. Ego simply means I or self. And then the suggestion is that the purpose of self-study, serious self-study, is that it can assist the transformation of this little self, not to get rid of it. That is, particularly in the Indian tradition, even the lowest level needs to be included, not to be discarded, to be gotten rid of, but not to get stuck with the lowest level. It's the same self that is going through transformation. What's the meaning of spiritual transformation? Not to get rid of something, but to change the quality of that something. So, to assist the transformation of this ego self or small self, this is where, again, so much emphasis on impartial self-study, because awareness is the mechanism of transformation. Gospel of Philip, again, of course, non-canonical. If you know Christ, you become Christ. This is a direct quote. Whatever knowing and being are intimately connected. Actually, two Greek philosophers, Parmenides and Plotinus, say exactly what I just said. And in the Upanishads, you can read this again. For example, this is a quote from Mandukya Upanishad, Parama Brahma Veda Brahmeva Bhavati. One who knows highest Brahma becomes Brahma. Awareness is the mechanism of transformation. This is why the reason again and again on self-awareness or self-study, as I study myself impartially, a change will take place in the quality of my being. This is the call. But as I said earlier, one of the dangers of self-study is seeing the devilish side in one and taking it too personally, which is why the recommendation in any serious teaching is to be periodically to meet with other fellow searchers. It is much more emphasized in Buddhism. Sangham, Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the teaching of the Buddha, and I take refuge in the community, Sangha, the community, which is also the meaning of the word ecclesia, by the way. In Greek, it means the community of those who are called. And it then gets translated as church. But a church can be that community. It's not forbidden. But if you have been to the churches, that's not the search that's going on there. But then the difficulty of a community is sooner or later somebody wants to proclaim as if they really know and you don't. Everybody will encounter something like this in any community. So it's not easy to have a community of fellow searchers, but it is necessary to have a community of fellow searchers. None of these things are easy, in any case, that I've been speaking about. The other more or less danger of self-study is sometimes one proclaims oneself especially if one is touched by something serious or deep, as if I am this specially chosen son of God. Fantasy and despair are the two major dangers of self-study. Both of them can be assisted by a community of searchers, but it's not so easy to have an impartial community of searchers. But it's worth trying to find again and again and doing one's part in it. Let's see if there is something I didn't. Maybe today there's not much time for me to focus on this, but I wanted to focus on very strong emphasis. It's actually at the heart of every spiritual practice. Emphasis on sacrifice. I need to stop now, but let me just remind, especially I'm thinking of my friend here from the Jewish background, Rabbi Hillel, hardly a negligible rabbi, actually said, you know, when it is said the Jews are the chosen people, of course the others criticize them for, oh, you are so arrogant, you think you're specially chosen. But chosen for what? Chosen for undertaking sacrifice. Throughout the Jewish history, this is what the Jewish people have undertaken. And Rabbi Hillel makes this remark, that God made this offer to all the nations and the Jews were the only foolish ones to accept it. This is not my remark, this is Rabbi Hillel. I'll return to this maybe next time because it's a very important area, so there's not enough time. Thank you very much. Take a moment.
Thank you.
Please bring whatever perspective you have about the whole question of spiritual search, or anything I said that is a slightly different way of expressing it or a better way of expressing it. Please do so. Or a question that you have.
Bobby, sorry to be behind you.
Yes.
Yes. You were talking about in different spiritual traditions how sacrifice, the word is used. In spiritual practice, something in me keeps preferring the word surrender, because in spiritual practice, the lower self has to surrender to the higher. I kind of recoil at the word sacrifice. Can those both be used interchangeably?
Well, of course, surrendering requires not being so attached to me. So, therefore, that is a sacrificing me in the presence of something much higher. So the word, I was actually going to take some time next time to speak about it, but since the question is being raised, sacrifice, if you look at the Latin origin of this word, comes from two words, sacer facer, meaning to make sacred. How does something become sacred? And the standard call, as far as I can see, in any spiritual teaching, is that the sacrificing my attachment to my usual self is the fundamental requirement. So there one can speak about surrendering, if you like. That'll be perfectly fine expression. And but particularly, since the question has been raised, maybe I should say here. One very standard remark in the Rig Veda, the oldest text in any Indo-European language, is yajna, which is the Sanskrit word for, which is almost always translated as sacrifice, written as Y-A-J-N-A, N with an umlaut on top. In South India, it gets pronounced as yajna. In North India, as yagya. So, but it's the same word. And Rig Veda says, yagya bhuvanasya nabhi. Yagya is the very navel of the cosmos around which everything turns. And this is at the heart of all spiritual teachings. Let me remind you again a standard remark in the Christian tradition, 3rd chapter of John's Gospel. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Gave for what? Hardly for a bowl of cherries. Gave for sacrifice. And Christ himself specifically speaks about it, that his whole mission, his whole baptism is to do with sacrifice. And again, I may have mentioned this at some other time. The Greek word for baptism is batam, which literally means immersion in suffering. And here it is, the word suffering gets attached to it, but suffering when undertaken intentionally becomes sacrifice. A very simple example, as you well know, particularly during the imprisonment of many of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, their starvation is being imposed upon them. But if I take a fast, I'm doing the same thing. I'm depriving myself of food. In both cases, it's deprivation of food, but in one case, it is intentionally undertaken. Intentional suffering is at the root of sacrifice. Imposed suffering is not sacrifice. And then, very strong suggestion, many of these things are difficult to verify in the usual scientific manner, but more and more research is being done even in that area, that if somebody undertakes a fasting, for example, it's very common practice in India, in any case, that if a child is sick, the mother will fast that night to assist the kid to heal. That more and more, even from a rigorously scientific perspective, which one should not always be depending on that. Look in your own experience. But even there, the suggestion that intentionally undertaking some prayers or this other for the others does seem to have an effect on the other people. So sacrifice is actually at the root of all spiritual undertaking. But the word, as I said, other words can be used. Surrender is okay to use. Giving up self-importance may be okay. Submitting is another one. Varieties of words can be used. But keep in mind that the root of that is to make sacred. And I already quoted from the Rig Veda, but in the Bhagavad Gita, especially in the 3rd and the 4th chapter, very much emphasis on yajna, both chapters. And there Krishna actually even says that that Brahma, which is everywhere, but it is specially anchored in sacrifice, specially anchored in yajna.
I think the problem, though, is when it becomes literal. Like the Rig Veda times, those early times, they would kill a horse or something in sacrifice.
No, but these things, as you know, the very first Upanishad, or the oldest Upanishad, tries to express this, trying to understand what is to be understood by the horse, what is to be... Everything gets externalized because it's much easier to understand this, right? But the suggestion in any spiritual teaching really is to see the internal meaning of sacrificing a horse. What is to be sacrificed? Like the dragon that I mentioned earlier, that St. George killing the dragon. What is the dragon that needs to be killed? But it is true that cultural transmission, let me repeat this again, cultural transmission is always done at the level of the children. There it is not. If I were to say to my granddaughter at the age of 4 or 5 that the dragon really means your internal small self, do you think this will make some sense to her? It's much easier to draw a nice painting of the dragon, show her classical paintings. So I think it's inevitable. We need to begin from where we are, which is always everything is represented at that sort of a level. But then the question is, how do I understand that more and more? This is the reason I showed that about the three magi as an example, and I mentioned to you. But you will see this kind of thing only in some special monasteries or special places where people have been wrestling with trying to understand the meaning behind it. Otherwise, it just gets conveyed again and again. The same words get repeated, and it remains understood at the surface level. Then sooner or later, people react against it and just move away from the church or whatever. But maybe when it is said that it is the very navel of the cosmos, look at anything to do with, in fact, that the cosmic order cannot be maintained without sacrifice. It's very deep in the traditions. Therefore, I give you another example, especially for my friend here from the Christian tradition. Book of Revelations. The Lamb of God was slain from the foundations of the world. A direct quote from the Book of Revelation. Partly, one of the things which is very important to understand, that a very important idea that major events, first of all, take place in the spiritual realm, then appropriate drama is required for them to be manifested in the material world. In the Western tradition, this thing was much more emphasized by two people, Swedenborg, who was a well-known scientist, then became mystically oriented, then actually returned to doing science, and William Blake. But in India, for example, I give you an example from the Bhagavad Gita, 13th chapter, when Krishna, sorry, not the 13th, 11th chapter, when Krishna shows his great form to Arjuna, Arjuna sees the very warriors he is being asked to fight have already been killed. He then actually asks, what should I be doing? And the response is, the Sanskrit word is nimitta. Nimitta matra bharata. Nimitta can be meaning you become the means of transmitting this, or you become the instrument for expressing this. It's a difficult word to translate into English. So Krishna says, yes, that has already taken place, but now you become the appropriate instrument for this to be manifested in the material world. Same thing, let me remind you here, this may surprise some of the Christian friends of mine. Judas was the most exalted disciple of Christ. You can even read, there is now a gospel called Judas Gospel, non-canonical naturally. And at the Last Supper, he is given the place of honor by Christ. And then Christ himself makes this remark that anybody he nourishes or feeds can never perish. And Christ gives the first loaf to eat to Judas. But actually, this was a remark made to me by Peter Brook, the great theater director. He says every director actually knows that to find an actor to perform the most evilish acting requires the greatest actor. So Christ needs somebody, as it were, to do something completely contrary to what people might imagine, to betray him. Now, just to remind you, for 3 years he was the treasurer he was the keeper of the treasury. Would he betray him for 50 pennies? He's keeper of the treasury for 3 years. No, this is completely silly. Just read that carefully. You will see there immediately Judas is the most respected pupil of the Christ, most respected by Christ. But then now he's considered as the bad guy who betrayed Christ, etc. This will go on. Somebody wanted, Walter or something?
No, that was me. That was me.
Oh, you wanted to say something, sorry.
Well, I was wondering because I think about it in the sense of, so Judas was the one who's, betrayed Jesus. But at the same time, if you look at it from a wider picture, it set into motion the whole thing of Jesus's, what he was destined to do. So you almost need that impetus to be able to move things karmically toward what they need, where they need to.
Actually, one other thing I would be pointing out, a remark that Krishnamurti was often happy to quote. Betrayal and carrying on the tradition have the same etymological root, which is why what often people think that Krishnamurti was against the tradition. Betrayal also means to carry on the tradition. Look at the etymology of these words. Yes.
They also said everyone needs a Judas.
Who said?
Kay.
He said everyone needs a Judas.
Yeah.
No, really, in a way, I'm not trying to make this point or that point, but simply inviting you to take everything at the level which it gets generally propagated for 8 billion people to understand. The whole purpose of any practice is to understand things more and more subtly. What is understood by the masses, it may seem, what I'm saying may seem very elitist. So if that is what it seems, to hell with it, I don't care. But the whole purpose is to be other than the ordinary. Ordinary masses, who is practicing any damn thing? You tell me. We have now more than 2.5 billion Christians. How many of them are at the level of St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila or Meister Eckhart or any of these other people? So it's the same thing about, it's not only about Christianity. I mean, all of these Hindus, Hare Krishna, all very nice. I just mentioned the other day, some of you are not there, 40% of the elected parliamentarians in India are now, have criminal records against them. And they all have names like Rama and Krishna. So I think it may sound elitist or whatever, but it's very important to realize that the general level of the masses is very, very low. Even at a very, if you like, taking only one side of it, at least in Canada, it used to be said, maybe these days the whole idea of IQ is being questioned a little bit, but they used to say for anybody to enter a university, they needed to have an IQ of 120. And only 20% of the Canadians were entering university. That meant 80%, when you take the average, had lower than 100 IQ. Can you believe this? And so, what level are we speaking about?
Speaking right to that, what you're speaking of, the new generations that are coming forward are no longer studying. Look at the age group of people that come to the Theosophical, or go to any church. The age, you're the youngest, this lady here looks like the youngest person here. So the new generations are off on another track somewhere. What would Blavatsky in her books say about these times? Or the Vedas, what did the Vedas say about these times that we're moving into AI? AI is now writing books about spirituality. We're moving into some other zone, and are we becoming like the ancient ones? That when we die, when this group dies off, all of this has become just history for these new generations that are in a whole other sphere. They're in the quantum field. They're in a whole other zone when it comes to spirit and God. And, I'd love to know from you, your generation, what is it thinking about all this? Where does it go for sustenance, for heart, for spirit? Where does it go for that? Or does it not? Has it just gone to AI?
No, I think the point you're making is important to look at our present generation or present situation. But it may be also useful for me to remind you that, strictly speaking, this situation was there even in the presence of the Buddha, in the presence of Christ. More than once I have said here, I obviously don't know, but I imagine at least 10,000 people, maybe even 100,000 people may have heard Christ in Jerusalem. How many followed him? 1.5 dozen. So this has always been the case. Very few people are actually interested. But these days, largely because communication has become so prevalent because of technology, so you may be slightly more aware of this problem, or more numbers can be looked at. But throughout human history, in fact, let me remind you, this may surprise some of you people here. In the oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, this is the remark that a farmer is unhappy if even one cattle is lost. That the devas, which we like saying angels, let us say, are unhappy if even one person wishes to wake up to reality. Then they send either a seductress to seduce him or somebody to try to kill him. Because the cosmic order requires this dumbness of being born and dying, eating and excreting, earning and spending. That, according to the Upanishad, is the cosmological order. Waking up is extraordinary. It is against the usual cosmological order, and the forces will try to intervene. That is what the devil does, try to intervene. So, if you sometimes find yourself thinking that I am interested in something spiritual, that is already against the cosmic order according to the oldest Upanishad. Most people are just, what do you think the cattle are doing? Why are they different from human beings? Just eating and excreting, fighting for more sex, for more food. Look at any of the animals. Why are we any different? I know all this sounds sort of terrible, what I'm saying, but you can, actually every great teacher would say something like this, but they try to put it rather nicely and mildly so that people don't get wholly upset by some of these remarks.
It feels to me like there's a fracture in the cosmological wheel. It feels like there's a fracture. It doesn't feel like we're doing the same cosmological dance here, generation after generation. It feels like, for me personally, in my own spirit body, I feel like there's a fracture that's happened. Something, call it serious,
Yes.
has happened in the cosmological rag, you know? It's like the dance is not the same anymore. And where do we place ourselves? How do we live within that fracture?
And you feel the reason for saying what you just said because you don't find many of the young people interested in something.
Whole generations. And you were talking about the children earlier. The parents teach the children how to. The parents aren't, I don't think there's parents. And the young parents, now that are in their 30s and 40s, haven't been connected to spirit. And so they're not passing it to their children very much.
Yeah. No, I certainly don't disagree with you that at present we are at least more and more, this is more and more visible in any case, whether it may even be. I'm not trying to say that it's the same percentage now as earlier, but generally, on the average, very few people have been interested at any given time in the presence of the Buddha or the presence of Krishna or Christ. Very few people are actually interested to follow him. But you may be right that maybe the numbers are even smaller now than earlier. And you go to, I'm always so surprised by you go to any spam mails that you get. They're always trying to sell something to you. or go to a supermarket and the kind of music, etc., that goes on. And all that has an influence on us very strongly, actually, on the whole generation. Somebody wanted to raise a hand. Is that what you were pointing?
Letitia.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I thought it was very interesting to look at. You had said that there were very few depictions in the Christian tradition of saints and saints meditating or something like that. So I thought I would try to find something because I thought I remembered a few. And it's really interesting. They were mostly about the desert fathers, the hermits and the Cenobites, who confronted their demons in the midst of contemplation. There are many great paintings of St. Anthony surrounded by his demons. And it's really interesting to me that some of them were able to have a kind of self-knowledge through this externalization, through describing their demons. And one of my favorites, which I rediscovered, was Evagrius Ponticus, who lived in the 4th century. And of course, this was a very corrupt era, the end of the Roman Empire. So, it was probably not a whole lot different from ours. And he felt that he had been so badly corrupted, he had to become a monk. So he describes all of his demons, and they're fascinating. I recognize all of them. And he was considered a heretic because he was a follower of Origen. And Origen taught that the demons were included in going back to the One. They were going to eventually achieve union with God. It's very, very heretical. So he paid attention to these demons, and he said, for example, that the demon of anger was given to us so that we could fight the other demons, the energy of anger. So anyway, that's something that I find is very interesting in Christianity, that the very early people, rather than people who came later, seem to have had the most, the clearest idea of self-knowledge.
Well, thank you for pointing all this out. But anybody wishes to comment on this or add to this? Or
By the way, there's one demon. It's called acedia, and it's I recognize this too. It's sadness over something that you've given up. Like if you give up something, this demon will come to you with images of all these things you've given up, and kind of torment you that way. And I can remember that during certain periods of Lent, that happened to me. So anyway, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that you were mentioning that the demons were sort of they had their own sort of virtues in a sense, that they are helping us in some way. And that seems to be carried out by these early people who are just fascinating.
okay, anybody else wishes to? Yes.
I'd like to comment about the generational question, since it was directed toward me a little bit, so I feel like I should say something.
You're the youngest member of the generation here.
Potentially. So when that was being shared and you were discussing it, the thing that kept coming back to my mind was what you talked about at the beginning this morning, about how the example of different people starting in different places trying to get to the White House. And I think, somebody takes a ship and somebody takes a camel and somebody takes a car. And I think that
it can be really useful to look at different generations in the same way. They're all starting from a different age at a particular point in time. They're all starting from a different point in time that the culture was in when they were born, and so that's all going to affect the traditions that they follow, the things that they find interesting, the things that they see as important for spiritual growth. And I don't think that just because this room isn't filled with a bunch of young people means that younger people have been led astray. I think they're riding a horse instead of a camel. And so it's just because we don't see them here doesn't mean that they're not doing the work in their own way, in a way that they find useful and interesting and helpful.
Yes.
In this past week and a
Can you
half,
speak a little bit more loud?
in this past week and a half, there's been a lot of young people in so
A lot of young people, what?
we're here.
Generational comment. I think the millennials are, I can't speak for all of them, but a little bit discouraged. High school kids are really interested in climate change, and they're really interested in school shootings, and they're super interested, especially high school girls, on what's happening with the abortion laws. So they're much more politically and socially aware and active. And so that's where I see their spirituality, and they're ley line into their own times. These are big times.
This is difficult to be sure about, but my impression is that the younger generation, you're quite rightly saying, that they're much more interested in even climate change or how the planet can be assisted in one way or the other. Or even acknowledging that other races or other genders need to be considered seriously rather than dismissing them. So, but my impression is that what perhaps you might even call, or we might generally call, spiritual practice, more or less moving away from that is largely actually the consequence of what takes place in the churches. Churches have done more harm to spiritual practice than anything else. Then, because that is not engaging people to what they hear, what goes on in the churches. And then if somebody from outside the church invites or engages them in concern about climate change or assisting people who have different races, different genders, etc., that has much more call for them. So the difficulty here is actually arising from what goes on in the churches in the name of the religion. That is much less engaging to the younger generation than these other things here. That's, at least, I think that's what people are implying, and I'm just putting it together. Also, one should, sorry, did you point out something?
Diane would like to
Yes. Please unmute yourself.
mute.
Just speaking of personal experience, my life when I was younger was so much more focused on survival and the outer world. So I don't think it's a coincidence that there are a lot of gray-haired people here. Myself, I have the time, it's kind of a privilege even, to be able to do the inner work in the way that I can now, when I'm not working as much or out in the world, or even dealing with the crises that are going on in the same way that are going on in our planet, whatnot. I can contribute money, there's things I can do, but the work outside seems to be for younger people a lot of times. So I just wanted to bring that up. And it seems obvious that there are a lot of gray-haired people, but we have less time theoretically to live. It might be a higher priority to do some of the inner work we weren't able to do when we were younger.
I have a daughter and a son. When they were in their late teens, both of them undertook to go to what we would call an underdeveloped country and try to assist people there. My daughter went to Mali, for example, spent a year there trying to work. Similarly, my son also went to one of the countries in Africa. And I think for them, that makes much more sense these days than whatever we would traditionally call spiritual practice. This for them is closer to their spirit or their heart than anything else. In fact, I remember even, I may have even mentioned this at one stage, my daughter, particularly when she was 19, trying to do these things, she would criticize me for sitting in meditation just looking at my navel. That was her expression. But she would undertake protests. For example, this didn't happen very often, but Halifax, where we live, has a very large harbor. And in the Second World War, for example, the ships from USA will come and get hundreds of ships which can gather there. Then they will go together so that in the Second World War, so they can be more safe if they are together, hundreds of ships. So at one stage, a nuclear-powered ship was coming from USA. So my daughter was among some of the kids there who were protesting against it. And she was even arrested. I had to go and put a bail for her. But I feel she needs to do what is right from her point of view to undertake. So this is not something that we should dismiss. What I need to do is what I think. Now, for example, she will be much more willing and easy sitting in meditation. But this is now she's 52 years old, which is quite different from. But earlier, she was much more actively oriented. So I think spiritual practice doesn't always have to be of one kind. It has to, what is it that speaks to one deeply inside? And largely it has to do with a little freedom from just doing things only for myself or for my own advancement. So that is, if somebody is concerned about the planet or about some other country or other nation, other people, that is also spiritual practice. So I think the shift has, something has shifted. Another area which is, maybe some of you have not mentioned, because science and technology have developed enormously, and not only developed enormously, but they are being expressed much more on the, for example, internet as an example, which was not there hardly 30 years ago. And that means that people are much more knowledgeable about latest scientific discoveries or something like that. And they have quite a fascinating quality to them. Although personally, I feel increasingly that this can also be more and more distracting from looking deeply inside. Because they are studying, if you don't mind my using two Sanskrit words, they're studying Prakriti, nature. It's endless. From a spiritual point of view, the call really is to begin to search inside. Searching for Purusha inside. That's the call. But because it is so fascinating, it is not surprising that people are drawn to looking at it more and more outside. More scientific discoveries are more and more fascinating. And it is easier for people, for example, New York Times or Washington Post or any of them, it's easier for them to speak about the latest scientific discovery. They have discovered this or that.
I think that's very important what you just said about the inside and the outside.
Yes. But you see, this is where one needs to see that the outside is easier to represent in a newspaper. Inside, ultimately, is not something new. Any great sage, sooner or later, at their best, will come to the same kind of realization as the Buddha did or as Christ did. They're not finding something new. This has become one of the, let me remind you very simply, nobody can get a PhD in any field unless they do something new. In spiritual search, nobody is trying to do something new. The call there is something completely different. In scientific research, in fact, I remember in our physics department, we used to, periodically people would worry, oh my God, I hope next week they don't publish this, because then the student who is doing his PhD would have to start all over again, because it has already been published. Every thesis or every PhD work, here is an example, it has to be something new. In the spiritual realm, nobody is asking for something new or old. It has nothing to do with it. It is something true, something real. So I think we should not forget there are psychological fascinations also for something new, something which is being advertised on every newspaper. Every day you can look at it. Washington Post has a little item on the scientific discoveries for that.
That's all.
They don't have on spiritual discoveries.
That's also true of the arts.
Yes.
Something new has more value than something true.
But that also needs to be. But I feel always, this is again and again a reminder, especially, again, let me remind you a remark of Rumi. He says, earlier I was active, I was trying to change the world. Now I'm a little wiser, I'm simply trying to change myself. From a spiritual point of view, that itself is a shift, you see, when one begins to see that I need to have an inner transformation. But none of these great sages who actually come to some inner transformation, they're not against trying to change the world. In fact, there it comes from a much deeper understanding of something. Otherwise, to trying to change the world without having an internal real transformation can be a very dangerous enterprise, because Hitler was also trying to change the world, so was Stalin. So one needs to be very careful about trying to change the world. Time is up, so let's take at least a few moments to be quiet.